that you're with us this evening for the latest in our Alyth online lectures. It's turned out that every time I've asked someone to give one of these lectures, suddenly what they know about has become incredibly relevant and important to us, and none more so than Edie, who we started speaking a few weeks ago about her giving one of these lectures. And as we know, the world has very much moved around us to make what she's going to speak about particularly important. So I'm really thrilled that Edie is going to be giving our lecture this evening, focusing primarily on the impact of COVID-19 on BAME communities, but I'm sure in our Q&A afterwards, there'll be an opportunity to speak more broadly about issues of racial equality. As ever, if you would like to contribute to the conversation, the way to do so, the way to shape the conversation that happens afterwards is to send me an email to josh@alyth.org.uk, and then I will try and build what you ask into the conversation that I have with Edie after her presentation. So as in previous weeks, the best way to view this is to set your screen to active speaker. That will mean that you can see Edie as well as seeing the PowerPoint presentation that she'll be using. And just to let you know that the PowerPoint is coming from a different computer, not from Edie's. So it might just be a little bit slower, and Edie is going to have to say, "Next slide, please," as if she were giving a COVID-19 briefing and she was the minister in charge. So she'll be doing that through her talk as well. So that's enough for me. You'll hear from me again at the end. I'm really delighted that Edie Friedman is going to give our Alyth online lecture this evening.
Thank you very much, Josh. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you this evening. Before exploring this rather difficult topic of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on BAME communities, let me say a few words about JCORE. Next slide, please. We were created in 1976 in order to provide a Jewish voice on race and asylum issues. And we are concerned to do race equality education and campaigning, which of course has taken on a particular relevance now, because we're concerned that Jewish children learn about issues of race and asylum from a Jewish perspective. So we've developed a lot of education packs. We also do Black, Asian, Jewish dialogue, and a lot of that took place in the past around someone's breakfast table. But from there, we created an exhibition, a traveling exhibition, which explored the connections between Black, Asian, and Jewish communities in Britain, not to compare experiences in the sense of comparing what was worse, Holocaust or slavery, but to say we all have our unique experiences and we need to learn from each other as well as wider society. We have a new group now, which is called a Black, Asian, Jewish Alliance, which looks at questions of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, as well as anti-Black racism. And we do a lot of work on asylum and refugee issues. On a practical level, we befriend unaccompanied minors, we mentor refugee doctors, we support drop-in centers, and we do a lot of campaigning on a range of issues, such as in support of the Dubs Amendment to bring in unaccompanied refugee children and young people into Britain, another campaign to allow asylum seekers the right to work if they've been in the country for 6 months. And unfortunately, there are many race and asylum issues that we have to campaign on, but it's really gratifying to get the support within the Jewish community and to work with partners throughout the asylum and refugee sector. I appreciate that the Jewish community has also suffered disproportionately from COVID, but tonight I would like to concentrate on BAME communities and to look at this, as I said, difficult issue of why Black, Asian, and ethnic minority communities are suffering disproportionately from the effects of COVID. Next slide, please. So for tonight's talk, I'd like to share with you some facts and figures, look at some possible causes, and what could also be contributing factors to this phenomenon. And finally, to ask, what can we do to make the situation better? But first, to set the scene, of course, a lot has been written over the past 10, 11 weeks. It's hard to keep track, isn't it, about the situation we find ourselves in. But one quote that really stuck out for me was from an American academic called Cynthia Enlow, who wrote in response to the often expressed notion, next slide please, that we are all in it together. She wrote, "We aren't all in this together. We're all in the same rough seas, but we're in very different boats. Some of those boats are very leaky. Some of those boats were never given oars. Some of those boats have high-powered motors on them. We are not in the same boat." And I think that really sums up the theme of this evening, and that is about inequality and difference between different communities. Next slide, please. So first to start and to look at some facts about Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. This group makes up about 14% of the total UK population, but 35% of patients in intensive care who are suffering from COVID-19. The Office for National Statistics came up with a rather startling fact that you are up to 4 times more likely to die from COVID if you are a member of a BAME community. And it's important to point out that only 5% of the BAME community are over 60, compared with 18% of the white population. So we're talking about a relatively young community, and we know that one of the risk factors for COVID is age. I also heard this morning about the rare Kawasaki type inflammatory disease in children who've been exposed to COVID-19. And there they have found that 80% of the children who have this rather rare but can be quite awful disease actually come from BAME communities. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a selection of NHS staff who've died from COVID-19, and it reflects what's become apparent, or what has been apparent for quite early on, and that is the disproportionate number of people from BAME communities who are NHS staff, who were, alas, NHS staff, who have died from COVID. Next slide, please. So some of the statistics around NHS staff: of the first 11 GPs who died, 10 came from BAME communities. 71% of nurses and midwives, 94% of doctors and dentists, and 56% of healthcare workers. So you see a really very disproportionate degree of how care workers or health workers from BAME communities are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Next slide, please. Moving away from statistics for a moment, and just bringing us back to the very human side of this issue, I was struck by an article I saw in The Guardian reporting the death of 5 friends in Birmingham who died at the beginning of May. They were all of Pakistani origin: Mia, Chowdhury, Jawad, Umar, and Nazir. They were considered the pillars of their community. They worked in business, charity, and local politics. And coming from immigrant families, these men were described as the backbone of their community and the keepers of its history. These 5 friends were frequent guests at each other's homes for tea and gossip. And one of their children commented, after his father died, that their generation came over when times were much harder, and they laid the foundation for us. Without them, we wouldn't be where we are today. They were the fighters. And I think their lives provide a snapshot of multiracial Britain today, one which, of course, we in the Jewish community can identify with. But their deaths also shine a spotlight on the extent to which racial inequality is still very much a feature of Britain today. And one hopes that this terrible pandemic that we're living through will help us or lead us to correct this injustice. Next slide, please. So moving away from some of the health issues, wanted to look at the economic effects on BAME communities as well. Research has shown that BAME communities, or the poorest communities, are the hardest hit during this period when, of course, there's a lot of economic uncertainty. They are, it is said, most affected by the economic downturn. And there's, of course, a lot of anxiety that because of the recession, that things will only get worse. And also, of course, this is a group of people who are less likely to be able to work from home. They're in insecure work, and many of them have lost their jobs. And of course, we know through history that when there are economic difficulties, this is the time that populism, xenophobia, and scapegoating can be on the rise. And we know that people like Tommy Robinson and others within far-right groups are starting to flex their muscles. And certain things like calling coronavirus either the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus or the Muslim virus. And I'm sure others have even called it the Jewish virus. So this is something that is really it's a big cause of concern, that the amount of xenophobia and scapegoating that this pandemic and the economic consequences will give rise to. Next slide, please. So life for BAME people in Britain today. Members of BAME communities are twice as likely to be unemployed, 5 times more likely to be homeless in London, 3 times more likely to live in overcrowded accommodation and multiple occupancy. What I found really shocking was the statistic that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. And also very shocking is that children from BAME communities, 45% of them are growing up in poverty. And this compares to 26% of children in white communities. And of course, it's shocking that any child should have to grow up in poverty. Next slide, please. Before going on, I wanted to mention, and I know that the first lecture you had was from Professor Michael Marmot. And of course, he is the sort of world expert in providing research to show how inequality has a profound effect on health. And of course, everything that goes with health, well-being and life expectancy. And it's important that we have this in the forefront of our minds all the time, that things do have repercussions. And if people are living in a state of destitution, in a state of poverty, this will have a knock-on effect, not only in leading to susceptibility to things like COVID-19, but of course to other illnesses as well. So in addition to deprivation, what are some of the other possible factors that have led to this situation of BAME communities being disproportionately affected by COVID-19? Well, some people wanted to know whether there was any genetic reason. And I think this has largely been discounted because there isn't any genetic link between different BAME groups. Would it help if people took vitamin D? Well, I think at the moment, I've been told there's actually no evidence that the lack of vitamin D is a contributory factor, but this needs more research. Underlying health conditions such as diabetes and heart disease, which we know minority communities also suffer disproportionately from, could very well have an impact. And we certainly know that diabetes makes things much more difficult for those people who are suffering from COVID-19. Occupational exposure. Many people from BAME communities find themselves as transport workers, security staff, health and care workers. So people who have very frontline jobs and a lot of face-to-face, literally, exposure to many people. And there has been a lot of concern about the number of people within these categories, not only health workers, but transport workers and security staff who have died from COVID. So this occupational exposure does seem to have a very big impact. And what about discrimination and racism? Next slide, please. A survey of 2,000 BAME health workers found that 84% felt that discrimination was a factor. And I think ITV actually carried out this survey of 2,000 BAME health workers, and they did find this high proportion did say that discrimination, racism is a factor. The British Medical Association also did its own survey, and they found that 4 out of every 10 BAME GPs had adequate PPE, compared to 7 out of 10 white GPs. And also 64, as part of the same research, the same survey, 64% of BAME doctors felt pressured to work with inadequate PPE, compared to 33% of white doctors. And we know there have been some very, very sad, very disturbing accounts. There was a Dr. Tung, who was a doctor originally from Burma, who was very concerned about his PPE, and it was said he did plead with the authorities. And as we know, there was a real shortage of PPE early on in the pandemic. And we know that the son of another doctor who died is actually planning to sue someone, I'm not sure who, because of failure to provide adequate PPE for his father. Next slide, please. Now, in response to these concerns, the government did commission a report called Disparities in the Risk and Outcomes of COVID-19. And this report was commissioned by Public Health. Now, the government commissioned the report and asked Public Health England to carry out the research. And to be absolutely honest, people have been quite disappointed by this research. It did confirm previous findings that have certainly been out in the public arena, that BAME communities suffer disproportionately from COVID-19. But there was a lot of concern that they did spend a lot of time doing community consultation, and the community consultation, which would have brought to life and given a lot more evidence to things such as discrimination, this part of the consultation was not included. And some people have said that it was taken out. Now, I don't know where the truth lies, but certainly there was concern that this important part of the consultation was not included. People were also disappointed that no recommendations were made. I guess because people are feeling quite anxious about their susceptibility to getting the disease and getting it to such an extreme way that it could lead to extreme ill health and death, that they wanted to see some immediate recommendations to protect those many BAME healthcare staff who are working, and also people who have frontline jobs. You would have heard the terrible story of the woman, the mother, who worked at Victoria Station in the concourse and a man who said, I have COVID, who then spat at her. She subsequently died, and there is some dispute if she did die from this, but she suffered from ill health, and she never should have been put in a position of being in such a public place like Victoria Concourse. And so there are all sorts of questions that can we, if there are vulnerable people because of being members of BAME communities or because of underlying health conditions, that they should not be put in a position where they are more susceptible to catching the disease because of their proximity to the public. The report has now been given over to the Equalities Minister, who says that she is taking things forward. And the Equalities and Human Rights Commission are setting up their own inquiry, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. The Labour Party has also set up its own inquiry, and Baroness Doreen Lawrence, the mother of Stephen Lawrence, has been asked to carry out this inquiry. Next slide, please. I wanted to, again, bring in Michael Marmot, because in response to the research report done by Public Health England, and I think generally the whole situation, he has said that the pandemic has highlighted and amplified inequalities within our society. And we need, starting now, to address structural racism and the deep-seated inequalities that cause inequalities in health. So he is saying we really need to act now. Don't give it to another committee, but we know a lot of things, and it's important that we start to work on those things that we do know in order to make the situation better. Even during this time when the rate of the disease is decreasing, there are still, of course, too many people getting it. And you obviously we need to do everything that we can to minimize the effect, particularly for those people who are most vulnerable. Next slide, please. So what about migrants? So we're moving over to people who are probably from BAME communities, but not necessarily so. And there's an organization called Patients, Not Passports, who are very concerned about what is happening to migrants during the period of the pandemic. And their concern is that migrants are not coming forward for healthcare because the hostile environment, which we thought was a thing of the past, seems very much a thing of the present. And so there's a lot of anxiety that if you come forward to ask for health care, you might get deported. And you will be in a very difficult position. And of course, if you have a family to feed or to feed yourself, making yourself more vulnerable is something that you would be very cautious to do. And they are also experiencing other additional barriers to accessing healthcare in terms of language and digital exclusion. And people, during this period, people were supposed to be exempt from charging and immigration checks, but there are too many cases where people are still being asked for their passport. And this obviously is contributing to the feeling that the hostile environment is, alas, still very much with us. Next slide, please. So whilst all of this is going on, what else is going on in the race and asylum world? A number of these things will contribute to how we react, how we deal with the pandemic. There's been a campaign to speed up the requalification process for refugee doctors. There are, we don't know how many, 1,000, 2,000 refugee doctors who come to this country. And what this campaign has said is that instead of taking their final exams later on in the summer, bring the exams forward, because a number of refugee doctors say because of their experience in working in really terrible conditions with a lot of stress, that they could really help the National Health Service in dealing with this pandemic. So this campaign has been running. It hasn't been successful, I'm sad to say. I know refugee doctors have been employed in other areas of healthcare, but it's important that they are fully qualified and given full qualifications. And this is not just of course, people are going to make sure that they pass all the necessary exams, but it is just simply to speed up the process when they can take exams. People were very concerned. There was an NHS surcharge for health workers, and the government changed its mind, but there are still key workers who still have to pay the surcharge. And so if you have a family with 2 children, and you have to pay up front for a number of years, it could cost you £10,000. And of course, as we know, many key workers have very poor salaries, and it would be a real struggle for them to find the £10,000 to pay the NHS surcharge. The immigration bill is also causing a lot of concern in terms of recruitment and retention of staff. And if we have a points-based system, and also if you have to earn a certain salary in order to qualify, of course, a lot of key workers, because they're on poor salaries, will not have the salary that is needed. But it also contributes to this atmosphere of anxiety and sort of distrust and unease that you're not wanted, and if you're not wanted, will you be sent back to your country? And that's a particular concern for obviously asylum seekers and refugees. NRPF, no recourse to public funds, another issue that's been recently debated, and that could be affecting 1 million adults and over 140,000 children. And these are people, the adults who have been paying and working, paying their taxes, but they're still not eligible for many of the benefits, which means they will be living in destitution. And destitution and COVID-19 are not things that you would want to put together. Race hate crimes. There's been a 21% increase in reported race hate crimes against East and Southeast Asian communities since the pandemic began. And as I said before, the far right are flexing their muscles and planning, we'll perhaps talk a bit about statues a little bit later, but they're coming to protect statues and just to, I guess, stir up a lot of anxiety about the pandemic as the so-called foreigners are being blamed for its existence. The Windrush scandal has not been sorted out, and of course there was so much media attention about the injustices done to the Windrush generation. And when I last checked, there were about 15,000 cases that needed to be settled in terms of compensation, but only about 36 have actually been resolved. So there's an awful lot of work to do there. And the longer it goes on, it's just perpetuating that sense of injustice, because these are people who feel British, their whole lives have been British, and they, in a sense, because of the scandal, have been told, you're not really one of us. Wanted to mention another issue, which probably will gain prominence now, is a slavery memorial. Since 2007, there's been a campaign to say that the victims of the slave trade ought to be memorialized properly. And unfortunately, the £3,000-4,000 needed to put up a permanent memorial has not been forthcoming. And I think it's quite scandalous that this is so, particularly when other memorials are put up. And of course, slavery is a part of British history, and we need to deal with that. Not to make people feel guilty, but this is part and parcel of our experience, and it needs to be properly acknowledged. So next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot, what I've tried to do this evening, of what is the situation. Obviously, it's very complicated. There's a lot of evidence, there's myths, there's a lot of misinformation, but we know enough so that government and others can actually do something. So let me just name a few things that the government should be doing. A number of people, mainly Black academics and some politicians and activists, and some rabbis and other people from faith communities have signed what is called a race equality strategy that needs to be implemented. It's called a COVID-19 race equality strategy, that because COVID-19 has thrown up so many issues of inequality, now is the time to do something about it. And so we need what a number of people are calling a 1945 moment. Of course, in 1945, the time that Reconstruction after the war, mixed with optimism that we could change society for the better, including the creation in 1948 of the National Health Service. We need that same sort of galvanizing spirit to really say that the inequalities and injustices within our society need to end, and we need to, in a sense, have a sort of social contract between the people and the government to have a different sort of society where these injustices are certainly decreased. And as part of that, it means that we need to systematically tackle poverty within the UK, because levels of poverty are much too high. Next slide, please. And just to sort of complete this section about what the government should be doing, if I could quote Lord Simon Woolley, who was one of the people, I don't know how many people heard the panel that JCORE did with JW3 on Sunday night, but Simon, who is head of the government's race disparity unit, he was appointed by Theresa May, and is one of the founders of this new strategy, this COVID-19 strategy, says, if anything good is to come from this awful disease, is that we track what has been exposed and amplified as discriminatory, and we fundamentally fix it. Very wise words, which we really need to act on. Next slide, please. So what can we in the Jewish community do? I've named 6 things, and of course there are many more. The first is continuing to support refugees and asylum seekers, and I know that for a number of years, Alyth has run the Refugee Drop-In Center, and there are another 6 synagogues who run drop-in centers for asylum seekers. And it's so important that our community continues to support these centers, albeit that they have to be done remotely now. And this is obviously causing a lot of difficulties about how to be with people, how to help people when you can't have the physical contact with them. But the drop-in centers have done an amazing job in providing support, whether it's through laptops or providing food vouchers in order to maintain some support for vulnerable refugees and asylum seekers. We have to continue to campaign on refugee issues. I mentioned a number of them before: the right for asylum seekers to be able to work, the necessity to bring in more unaccompanied minors. Lord Dobbs did hope we would bring in about 3,000. I think the figure stopped at about 480. And we need to revitalize that whole campaign, because there are a lot of very vulnerable young people and children out there. Moving on to issues of race, it's really important that Jewish children have the opportunity to learn about slavery, whether that's done in Jewish schools, or whether it's done at Cheder. It's really important that Jewish children have that opportunity to have a proper understanding about slavery and its place within British history. It would be great to get support, and we have got the Board of Deputies to support this, because we need a permanent memorial to the victims of slavery. In response to why the money wasn't forthcoming, someone, government department, civil service said, well, you have a Stephen Lawrence Day. Now, Stephen Lawrence has nothing to do with poverty, and that is not a way to honor people's history by suggesting that there is another part of their experience. And if you have one part of that experience, you don't need anything else. So we really need to come to terms with our history. And obviously the events of the last week, 10 days, is showing this more and more. And of course, we need to call out racism wherever it appears. Racism, by racism, I mean anti-Semitism, I mean anti-Black racism, and I mean Islamophobia, and that needs to be called out in all political parties. And we need to hold all political parties to account and make sure that they have procedures in place to deal with all forms of racism. Next slide, please. And the sixth thing I mention is, I think we really need a Jewish campaign on combating poverty in the UK. We have an excellent organization, Zedek, which campaigns and does something about poverty in poor countries, but we really need to also look at our own house, our own backyard. It's unbelievable that 1.5 million people on a given day could go without meals. And it is scandalous that 4.2 million children now live in poverty. And it is predicted that this figure will increase to 5.2 million by 2022. And these figures come from economic organizations that look at the economy. So, you know, they're not from any particular political party or any particular pressure group, but they come from organizations such as the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Next slide, please. Now, I didn't think I could do this presentation without some sort of reference to George Floyd. And of course, many things have been said about him. And I was thinking that, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but the police officers who killed him by denying him oxygen have given oxygen to a worldwide anti-racist movement. And it's something that is really important, that we don't lose this moment to do something. Sometimes it can almost feel like that moment when the picture of Alan Kurdi, the toddler whose body was washed up on a Mediterranean beach, sort of it brought about a renewed tremendous interest in refugees and asylum seekers. A lot of that, of course, has disappeared, but nevertheless, it brought many people to be interested in that issue. And one could only hope that the murder of George Floyd will do the same, because the issues are issues for us as they are for every country, and we can't just dismiss them as things that happen in the United States. Next slide, please. And just to give one of the final words to the Equality and Human Rights Commission in response to the COVID situation and in response to the murder of George Floyd. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to tackle long-standing and entrenched racial inequalities. And I guess the question is, will we rise to the challenge? Will we do something about it? Next slide, please. And just finally to say that before taking any questions, that I would hope very much that the Jewish community can be a part of meeting that challenge, not only for the good that it may do for the whole country, but also for our need, I think, to reinvigorate a very positive, outward-looking Jewish identity. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. And next slide, just to say thank you and keep well.
Thank you, Edie, so much. The way that questions work, if this is your first one of these lectures, is that I will now have 15 minutes or so of conversation with Edie. And because we're so many people, we can't kind of go to you for questions. But if you do have questions, then please do keep sending them to me at josh@alyth.org.uk. So Edie, obviously I'd like to speak about the COVID, the impact of COVID, and also the broader picture as things are at the moment. Before we do that, so I studied social policy in the 1990s, and one of the things that we often were talking about was terminology. It seems I recall very long conversations about terminology around ethnic minorities. So you're obviously comfortable with and using the phrase or the word BAME as your kind of terminology, but I know that actually there's a lot of kind of challenge around the use of that terminology, and in particular the fact that it kind of hides within its, as you know, it kind of erases cultural difference, but also hides kind of diversity of experience. So I just wondered if you would kind of speak a little bit about why that's the phrase you use and how you feel about the kind of the language of race in this country.
Well, that's a really, really important question. And I guess as we try to express things, we, look for shorthand ways. I mean, when JCORE was created, we used to talk about Black communities, which encompassed also Asian communities and other communities, and then it went to Black and Asian communities. And I think this is part of the challenge of talking to, thinking with other communities, because language is a very fluid thing. And it is difficult to get it right. I mean, we know that in all sorts of areas, that language can get us into hot water in the way it's used. But I think, and one would hope that it is part of the challenge, that as I hope Jewish communities engage more with issues of anti-racism and issues within Black communities, that can also be part of the conversation. So I don't feel tied to any particular language, and I know that different colleagues use different words to express, and it's very difficult to get an overall consensus because of the way things change. And of course, we know in America, and some of this has also been adopted here, that people talk about people of color, and that is another phrase. So I think it's part of our challenge, actually, to think about and explore our use of language, and to know that sometimes we'll get it wrong.
I mean, I think people of color, of course, has exactly the same challenge associated with it,
Yeah.
which is that what it doesn't allow for is that kind of sense of focus on the very
Mm.
different experience of different groups.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wondered if what we know about the difference within ethnic minorities about the experience of COVID. So, is there a picture emerging specifically around COVID, but I suppose more broadly as well, about differentiation between the experience of different ethnic minority groups? And in particular, I suppose one of the things that's very interesting is whether or not there's some of the poor white ethnic minority
Mm.
groups, such as the traveller community or
Yeah.
Roma community, have also
Yeah.
had,
Yeah.
who are kind of some of the poorest in our society, are
Sure.
also experiencing disproportionate impact.
Yes. I mean, I think you find there are concerns about Pakistani communities and Bangladeshi communities who can be the poorest of Black and ethnic minority communities. And absolutely, poor communities, whether they're travelers and people who are, born in Britain, who don't identify as travelers, of that poverty. And what we must do is not, in a sense, say that we're favoring one group over another. We need to get things right for all of us. And to have inequality hurts Britain as a whole. And one would want policies in place that addresses inequality and poverty as it affects everyone. And absolutely, you would not want to leave any group behind. And of course, the language that we heard about the left behind, there are many challenges there. And we just have to work harder to get them right.
Um, so, I mean, I'm in no way trying uh, suggest that there isn't a disproportionate impact on BAME communities.
Mm.
Obviously, I mean, it's an interesting thing is to kind of, because there's 7.5 million people. That's a category that so it's that interesting question of real specificity of experience. Um, I was also kind of, when you were talking about some of the statistics, I think the one that really stood out for me, and I had someone email me specifically about it as well, was the experience of BAME doctors with regard to the availability of PPE.
Mm.
Because so one of the questions is kind of, we know there is a general pattern of health inequality with ethnic minorities,
Mm.
but that suggests something much more systemic within the health service about uh, race, essentially, and kind of racism. And I know, a couple of doctors from within Barnet have said this feels very challenging for them as
Mm.
a statistic. So can you kind of maybe say a little bit more about that? Because that feels particularly extraordinary.
Well, I mean, a number of doctors have reported that they feel, that they mustn't make a, a fuss. They feel that they'll be more likely to be bullied. So there is a feeling amongst some doctors that they are perhaps being put in jobs that other doctors would not be put in. I mean, I think, a lot of this is people's experiences, but certainly the survey carried out by ITV did suggest that a lot of doctors do feel that something is going on, and that the health professions need to examine racism within its own profession. And I think there was a report or a statement done, I don't know if it was the Royal Society of Medicine yesterday or the Royal College of Physicians, which talked about racism within. And it needs challenging. And I mean, the statistics are not as easy to come by as other statistics, but there is a feeling that people are put in situations and have to behave differently from their white colleagues, or they will be reprimanded. Um, so the medical profession needs to look carefully at itself, but something is going on. Something Why do we have, one could understand a bit about communities generally when they're facing destitution, but we're not talking about destitution when we're talking about doctors. We're not talking about overcrowding when we're talking about doctors. So something is going on, and we really need to get to the bottom of it. And that's why it's a real shame that that bit of the report, which looked at what communities and individuals were saying about their experience, was left out of the divorce. We really need that material to help us to understand what is going on so we can correct it. Because, also we know this virus ain't going anywhere anytime soon. We're going to be living with it for some considerable time, and we need to get it right. So we need to engage more and find ways of listening to people's lived experiences. And I think a lot of Black doctors feel that this is not being done, and they're being shut out from that. But it certainly needs a lot more work, and it'll be interesting what the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, as well as uh, the investigation being carried out by Doreen Lawrence, and what sort of conclusions that they reach.
Right. So, I mean, I suppose what's interesting is it's not simply that this is a matter of general health inequality
Mm,
focused on this, amplified. That
yeah.
it feels like there's something else that's being revealed here.
Mm,
And I suppose the within the broader context of you know what is happening more broadly in the Black Lives Matter movement, what we're also seeing is a kind of a revealing of other sort of experiential differences and between ethnic communities as well. Um, Obviously, from our perspective, from my perspective, the particularly interesting one is around the experience of members of the Jewish community with ethnic minority backgrounds.
mm.
And I just wondered if you would say a little bit about, I mean, the Board of Deputies is proposing a commission, but what you've seen over the years in terms of the experience of ethnic minorities within the Jewish community, that lived experience within our community as well.
Well, I think it's an issue that we haven't, as a community, bothered very much with. It's always been there, and it hasn't been talked about very much. I mean, certainly people's experiences of, walking into a synagogue or walking into other communal spaces where they feel uneasy because of people's reactions, then I think we've sort of ignored the issue for a very long time. And it's interesting that when we had this panel on Sunday night, the two women speakers were both Black Jewish women who wanted to talk about their experience, and certainly wanted something done. And one of them said, I want to be able to go walk into kosher kingdom without people staring at me. I mean, so that she sort of summed up how she felt. And also, I mean, another comment, this is that she made, this is a woman called Nadine, who's a journalist, who was head of the ethnic minority campaign for the um, Cambridge Union, but said that she felt that during the debates around anti-Semitism, Jewish community expected others to stand up for doing something about anti-Semitism, but she felt it wasn't necessarily reciprocated in terms of dealing with anti-Black racism. So we have a lot of work to do, and I would like to see that as a very positive thing, that we take the opportunity to listen to Black voices, because I don't think we've been very good at doing that. And there are places, whether it's during the film festival, during book week, we just have to find more opportunities to listen to Black voices,
Um,
both in our community and outside
right,
our community as well.
right. Um, And of course, the nature of the Jewish community, which is itself evolving, means that that becomes increasingly important,
Yeah.
as as our community becomes more open and more diverse in some ways. So, um, so we've got about 5 minutes. So I'd love to sort of take a step back and look at the broad span of what's happening um, within the world at the moment, and the protests triggered by the death of the police brutality in America, but now spread around the world. Do you think we're in a different moment? I mean, is this something different to what you've seen before over your many years being involved in this particular area?
I'd like to think so. I've certainly received more emails this week than I have, I think, in the first 43 years of JCORE's existence. And also the emails are different in they're saying, what can we do? What is, where should we start? And so I think it can be very positive that people now want to engage with issues that we've been trying at JCORE to get people to engage with for a very long time. And it's just amazing, I mean, in a sense about why the death of this one individual, and there have been many others like him before, and what is different about his murder that has galvanized so many people. So I think we need to capture this, and I think we need to do it for the sake of our own community, that this is a very positive, important thing to do, because we are a part of a very diverse, multiracial, multicultural community, and we're all stronger if we participated in the way that we need to, knowing that some of the things are going to be very challenging and very difficult, but hey, that's life, isn't it? So that's part of the challenge. So I hope that this week has been different from all other weeks.
And one thing that certainly feels different to me is a level of forced introspection about British history
Mm,
as well. And I would suggest, what's coming for many of us is also a kind of perhaps a level of forced introspection about Jewish history as well.
mm, yeah,
Um, but what we've seen in the the tearing down of statues of slave traders, and this real kind of some of it feeling very challenging. I mean, particularly when it
mm,
comes to kind of national heroes being targeted.
yeah.
Um, how do you feel about this kind of balance of holding our history and sort of the muckiness of our history as well, whilst also honouring the experience, the real lives experience of people from ethnic minorities?
I mean, it's a bit ironic that we don't have a statue commemorating the victims of slavery, but we have a number of those who profited and were engaged in slavery. I mean, I think there is a place that certain statues need to be in museums, and we need to have proper context about what people represent, both any positive as well as negative things. So we can't shy away from that history. We can't shy away from Coulson's and who built the National Gallery. I mean, so much of what this country is, there is a relationship with slavery, and that has to be acknowledged if we're going to, I think, move forward. And it's a difficult balancing act, isn't it? But we need, as I say, it would be a great start if we just had something that commemorated the victims of the slave trade. And to think, here we are in 2020, we don't have anything. And it's really shameful. And I would like the Jewish community to be working alongside others to say, this is part of our history and we want to acknowledge it. Um, but there will be some awkward conversations, and we know that. But people have suggested that museums are a good place to put some of the statues, and also to help educate people about what individuals stand for.
So we're coming towards the end of our time. I mean, I it feels like a number of things are different. I suppose one of the other things that's different is the breadth of acknowledgement of a problem. So when you get I mean, it sounds trite, but the NFL in the National Football League in America have never named racism as an issue, even
Mm.
though it so clearly has been. And similarly, kind of the statement from the Royal College of Physicians, which is, a very open recognition of the challenge of racism within the NHS and or within the medical profession and within society. With that change, with that sense of awareness and openness, do you feel a level of optimism right now?
Well, it depends which moment you ask me. I mean, I think we have to. I mean, look, we're really all in challenging circumstances, fighting this unknown thing out there. And we have to hold on to things that are positive. And it's so in the middle of this terrible, surreal experience that we're all having comes this horrendous murder in the United States. But hopefully it's given us something positive that we could be better than this. And Brittany can be a better society, but we have to tackle a lot of the injustices because whilst poor people, whether they're black or white, are living in poverty, they are shut out from participating in society. And we want to create conditions so that everybody has the same opportunities to participate and make Britain a better place for all of us, whether we are black people, white people. So I want to hold on to that optimism because it's really important where we all sit at the moment to have that optimism, and it can work. And I'm just seeing that the number of people and organizations who've written to me this week to say, where do we begin? What do we do? Well, let's do it. Let's use this opportunity to just get things better than they have been, because we can be better than we have been. And let's just do it.
Edie, thank you so much. That seems like a very good call to action on which to end. Thank you for sharing your experience and your particular insight this evening with us. We're really very grateful indeed. Um, so these online lectures are going to keep on going for as long as we are locked down, which looks like or unable to gather certainly. So we have the next couple of weeks certainly arranged and going in a very different direction. So next week we'll be joined by our member Mike Wellin, who is a leading organizational chartered psychologist, who's going to be speaking a little bit about his work and his experience of thinking about how we are in the workplace. So it's going to be 7 questions about our careers that we can ask. And then the following week, Professor Shani Orgad, another member of Alyth, is going to be speaking. She published a book on gender equality last year in 2019 about the experience of motherhood and gender equality and the real experience of the balance of gender in the home. So she's going to be speaking about that issue in a couple of weeks' time. So those are the next 2 of these lectures for tonight. Once again, Edie, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And everyone keep safe, and we will see you soon.